Good morning. Welcome to the Fierce and Fabulous Duo. I'm Sandra and I'm here with Dr. Toni. And today we have an esteemed guest. His name is Dr. Fred Gardaphe, and he is a distinguished professor of Italian American Studies at Queens College. Welcome, Fred. It's so good to have you here.
Nice to be here, Toni and Sandra. I'm excited. So take me on your fabulous and furious way.
Well, my first question to you is, what drew you to start teaching Italian American Studies, and what year was that?
Um, to start teaching it took a while, but when I was inspired by it when I went to Europe for the first time in 1978. It was one of those things where I had a Eurail pass. I had the summer off. I was teaching high school at the time, and I wanted to be a writer, and I kept trying to write, but I really didn't know what I was going to be writing about. And I went to Northern Europe and Denmark and Sweden, and the closer I got to Italy, the more emotional I was becoming, and I didn't know why. And I got to the land where my grandparents came from and met my relatives there, and it just created the sense of being born again. I felt like I had been here before. I had this place felt comfortable. I mean, I went to Italy thinking that I was Italian and came back knowing that I was not Italian, but I also wasn't American. So what was I? And the solution to that was I was an Italian American. All right, now what is that? So I began reading, I began interviewing people, I began looking for ways of finding out more information about not just my family, but all the families that had come into my neighborhood from Italy. And, what was it about this thing of being Italian that was unique from being any of the other ethnic groups that I had studied, whether it was in high school or college?
Mhm.
And I began to realize that nobody has studied, very few people had studied Italian Americans, and I started working in this area just on a personal basis of reading whatever I could, writing little notes to myself and journal entries. And at the time, I was beginning to teach at the college level as an adjunct professor. I had a high school teaching job, and I was teaching college, and I didn't think that I could ever teach what it was I was studying because there didn't seem to be any classes in that area. So eventually I decided to go on and try to create courses in that area. And I ended up with a film course I was teaching at Columbia College, which is an art school. And I started with an Italian American film course, which seemed very obvious because there were such great films. Nobody could deny the greatness of the films, the way that they had been denying the greatness of the literature. My English professors, when I went to grad school, for example, didn't think much of Italian Americans. They didn't want me to do a dissertation on Italian American writers. They didn't think it was worth it. So that led me to study Italian American culture and eventually contribute to the creation or the expansion of the field of Italian American studies.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Fred, for helping us understand your interests, where it all started. So help us understand a little bit more about the Italian American culture. What does the identity, I guess, from an outsider perspective, because the insider perspective would be different, but what does the identity look like today, and how has it evolved over time, if it has evolved over time?
Well, it has definitely evolved over time. I think that the distance away from Italy has created a kind of uh, floating sense of what it means to be Italian American. Some people think they're Italian American because they consume Italian products. Some people think they're Italian American because they eat Sunday dinners with their family. It's a lot more confusing in terms of developing an identity as an Italian American today than, for example, it was in my generation, where I would walk out on the street, and even if I didn't want to be an Italian American, the other people saw me as Italian American. And with the intermarriages that we have now, it's hard to tell who's Italian American, who's not. By name. When I was a kid, after a dinner, I usually had like red gravy, or we called it gravy, red sauce spots on my white shirt. And so they knew I was Italian just by walking down the street with the gravy stains on my shirt. And or the neighborhood that you came from. Most of the people in my neighborhood were Italian Americans, although the neighborhood was originally a German American neighborhood during my parents' generation. It became Italian American as the Germans began moving out and so on. So whether it was neighborhood or the way you looked, that was the key to identifying you or other people identifying you as an Italian American. Whereas today, people have to kind of go out of their way to say I'm an Italian American. Unless they have the stereotypical, really, dark skin, dark hair, kind of look that says, oh, you look Italian. But although I remember there were a lot of people in the 1980s who looked Italian, but they weren't. They were either, they were from the Middle East and they were pretending to be Italian because they didn't want to get identified as being from the Middle East. So it's much more confusing now, and I think a lot of what has to happen is now there needs to be more of a dependence on institutional development of identity. In other words, how can your identity be fostered not only in your home, but in the schools, in the libraries, in the museums? Do you see other Italian American artists on television? What images do you see? Which was a lot different from my neighborhood. I grew up in my neighborhood. I walked around and I saw old people who were speaking Italian. I saw, young people speaking Italian, and I could speak, some Italian, and it was a given that I was an Italian American. Whereas my children today, especially with a name like Gardaphe, which is actually a Basque French name, but I have three of my grandparents come from Italian background. It's hard to say, are you Italian? Are you not? And sometimes it's not a question that comes up as often as it used to. In terms of, when I was growing up, people would say, where are you from? They didn't mean what neighborhood you were from. They meant what country was your
Right.
from. So.
Yeah, and so Fred, this evolution, this change in the identity, how much of that has to do with acculturation?
Well, it has everything to do with acculturation because quite often, I'll give you an example. In my mother's generation, my mother's parents did not speak English very well. I was the first grandson, and so I interacted with them very strongly. I often served as their translators. And they wanted their children to become American. They didn't want their children to face the same kind of discrimination that they faced. And so they, encouraged them to not speak Italian, to learn English and to move on and to become part. I always say that the immigrant generation, my grandparents were economic immigrants. They came here because they wanted a chance to have a better life than they had in Italy. My parents' generation, I call them the sociological immigrants. They could not go to any neighborhood they wanted to and buy a house until they had reached some kind of financial level where people wouldn't question them. And even then, Italians were questioned and moving into certain neighborhoods inside Chicago. And then my generation has the burden of becoming the cultural immigrant. It's like, what of your culture are we going to allow to be part of this American culture? Now, what's interesting is that our food made it, and our history of painters and composers, they made it long before we would make it with our stories and our folk tales and our folk culture and our religious culture and so on. It took longer for that to enter the American mainstream, and really it hasn't that well. One of the things that very few people know about Italian Americans is the foundations of their behavior. In other words, why do Italians speak with their hands? Why do Italians um, why are the Italians maybe not tell you the truth fully? In order to understand that, you have to understand that Italy was a country occupied by foreign powers. And so people who live in occupied lands tend to speak in indirect ways. Uh, and they would use hands when they didn't want words to come out. I didn't want people to pick up the words that they were saying. And then this whole idea of not letting everybody know what's going on in your life ranges from outright telling lies to just not talking to strangers. Wow. And that is fundamental to Italian American culture. And it's something that, because the language was not passed out from one generation to another generation, those types of behaviors were inherited, but they weren't processed. In other words, people didn't understand why they acted this way. They just acted this way. And had our grandparents and parents been able to continue to speak Italian, we would have understood why that happened over the years. There was a phrase when my grandparents were in Italy in the 1900s, and it was called brigante o immigrante. Either you become a brigand or you leave, or you become an immigrant. And there were no two ways about it. Either you stayed and you fought against the system that was oppressing you, or you just left. And most of the Italians left. In the 1880s and 1890s, Italians were the largest immigrant group in the United States. Right. People were terrified that Italians were going to take over the world. The Catholic Church in the United States was founded by the Irish. Yeah. And populated by, and the hierarchy was populated by Irish priests and bishops. And they did not at all like the Italians coming in. And I mean, the example that I always give is that even in the 1950s, and 60s, when I was an altar boy, I served Mass for the Italians in the basement of the church. They would not allow us up into the actual part of the church to have our Italian Mass. And sometimes that was due to the Mass being held at the same time. But other times it was just like, your church, your Mass is in the basement, And we got this sense that we were, less than accepted. We weren't hounded out of the country, but we were tolerated more than we were accepted.
Mm-hmm. Wow, Fred, this is so interesting. I'm learning so much from you, especially this aspect about why Italians are so expressive. That there's actually a root of why this is. It's so fascinating. What about the differences? So there are different subcultures, if you will, or different languages, different dialects, so different groups of people. How different are they as Italian Americans when they come over and they assimilate in the United States? How different are they, for example, someone from Sicily versus someone from Naples?
It took America to create the idea of the Italian American. In other words, people who came over from Italy didn't see themselves as Italian, because quite often they were new to this idea of Italy being a unified nation, which didn't happen until the 1870s, and didn't happen, and it was a monarchy at that time, a republic. It didn't happen until after World War II that Italy was a democratic republic. And so people identified with their regions when they came over here. And they tended to, especially in a place like Chicago, they tended to live in neighborhoods where other people from the same region live. So it was very fortified. You have to remember that all of the Italian language comes out of Latin, along with influences from Arabic and French and all the other countries that have invaded and occupied Italy. And so the idea of speaking a dialect was a way of preserving one's privacy, one's intimacy with one's neighbors. You know, there's a saying there's this phrase in Italian, this word in Italian culture, which is campanalismo. Campanile is the bell tower. And it's like you relate to the people who are within the same sound of your church bell when you hear the church ringing. Now, we don't really have that much happening today, you know, the call for prayer. But the call for prayer happened very regularly when I was a kid in my Italian neighborhood. The Italian church would ring it at 6 o'clock in the morning, and then 8 o'clock mass, they'd ring the bells, and then at noon they'd ring, and then 3 o'clock in the afternoon they'd ring, and 6. I mean, they would ring the hours always and the half hours, but they would also ring the morning prayer, afternoon prayer, evening prayer, nighttime prayer, and so people, people separated themselves. Oh, you're the Sicilians, or you're the Pugliese, but even the people in Sicily or Puglia would have their own little towns. Or you're from Termini Imerese, and you're from Catania, and you're from Bari, or you're from Castellana, or you're from the Marche region. You know, people identified regionally more than they identified with the nation of Italy.
Okay, that helps answer my question. Thank you so much. So just to transition a little bit to your yearly seminars on Italian diaspora studies, would you tell us a little bit about the Italian diaspora? Teach us a little bit about that.
Sure. We started applying years ago to the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Arts to do summer seminars in the field of Italian American study as a way of helping to shape new generations of scholars and teachers, and to teach them, introduce them, and to help them develop their own courses in Italian American studies. And we were getting rejected by national agencies. They didn't think that what we were doing was, was part of what they would have called at the time the multicultural movement. And they didn't see the relevance behind it. So we went out, after a number of rejections, we went out and started raising our own money. And we started creating these courses where we took students, faculty and upper level graduate students, PhD students, to Italy every summer for 3 weeks, where we taught intense seminars. We thought it was important for them to be able to do it there, because there you get a better sense of the usefulness of the Italian language. Although we did get people who were complaining about, why are all these Italians speaking to us in Italian? Don't they know we only speak English? And so they had to, they were kind of presenting the chauvinism about being American, and yet they learned the humility of being somewhere and not understanding what's going on, which was the story of the immigrants who came to the United States and when they encountered English. So we started with courses in Italian American studies, and then we began to realize that we were getting people from Poland, people from Spain, people from China, people from Japan, all over the world coming and taking our courses. And they were always telling stories of the Italians in their country. I didn't know that there were Italians in Russia. I didn't know that there were Italians in China. I mean, we kind of figured maybe there were, but so we began to encounter people like from Australia, And they had very different stories about what it meant to be an Italian immigrant in Australia, Argentina, Buenos Aires, Chile, Peru. And we began to say, wait a minute, we're very narrow in looking at this field as Italian American. We had earlier encounters with Italian Canadians, but and when we began seeing Italians in Brazil, Italians in Argentina, then we started saying, wait a minute, this is bigger than us, and we started working with museums and cultural centers and academic institutions around the world. We had our first conference in Australia. And we called this the Italian Diaspora Studies, Italian Diaspora, I think it was Italian Diaspora Studies Conference or something. The second one we had in New York, the third one we had in Genoa, the fourth one we had in Argentina. Last year we had another one in Genoa because Genoa just created this beautiful Italian migration museum. And we're looking to have the next conference either in Vancouver or in Brazil. We're working on that. So we began to realize that this field matters more when you begin to understand the experiences that happen all around the world. And everybody's got an incredible story to tell, and they're very different. For example, the Italians in South America were not asked to stop speaking Italian. They still speak Italian. And their Italian has merged with Spanish, which creates an incredibly rich, interesting. When I went to Argentina, I could speak Italian to the people who live in the neighborhoods whose great-grandparents had been born in Italy, but they had never been to Italy. But I could still speak to them. And then, so the courses that I teach now in this program, I teach a literature course. Once upon a time, it was Italian American writers. Now it is Italian diasporan writers. So I have Italian Australian, Italian writers who lived in England, Italian writers who live in Argentina, South America, Canada. And so we're in the process now of building a better understanding of these multiple histories, multiple literatures, the arts, the musics, the films that come out of, and seeing what's similar and what's different. It's very interesting and very exciting.
Yeah, I can see how the field has emerged. It's more of a global perspective now. Right. It's so rich for students.
Right.
It's great.
And this way we get to gain a sense of what these cultures were and how they related to the indigenous cultures that were there. What was indigenous about Italian culture in Italy that has sustained itself, that has enabled other cultures to thrive from it. For example, the native indigenous peoples of the United States are always known for having this reverence and love and this caretaking attitude about the land they live on, the environment. Well, that's something that I learned from my grandfather just in the garden that he was maintaining. And through that little garden, he taught me the same thing that indigenous people, that you recycle stuff that goes in there that help nourish. You take the waste from your meals and you put it back in the ground, and so when the indigenous movement began to gain strength and force, I understood what they were talking about because I had the same kind of values instilled in me from my grandfather, who had brought his indigenous knowledge of Italy to the new land. And to me, that's what's going to save not just the environment, but it's going to save the divisiveness that is created. It's very strongly created in this country now, especially so.
Thank you for that. So, Fred, you have worked as a consultant for many documentaries and movies about Italian people, culture, and of course, the Cosa Nostra. So tell us a little bit about some experiences that stand out for you in your job as a consultant.
Yeah, I've been in many documentary films. Just this past weekend, for example, I was a consultant for a podcast that's being done on a serial killer who was an Italian American. I don't know anything about serial killers. I don't know, but they asked me for my background to talk about what is it inside Italian culture that this kid may have encountered. Not that drove him to kill people, but the kid grew up Italian American, and I was able to really give some insight, which I thought was common knowledge. But when I was talking to the person, they had no clue. This was a person from the New York Times who was writing this article about this guy. I think they called him the Hollywood Killer because he had killed a woman who Ashton Kutcher was coming to have a date with her, and he knocked on the door and he found her dead. But anyway, I mean, that's one of the strange ones. I wrote a book a while ago, From Wise Guys to Wise Men, which was an attempt for me to understand why the Italian gangster had such a strong presence in American culture, when in fact every other ethnic group had their gangster. Why was it the Italians? And after I wrote this book, I started getting asked to be in these the incessant number of documentaries that have been done on gangsters. I mean, you even have a crime channel which features gangster biographies and so on. And having grown up in that environment, I knew that there was more to our culture than those my grandfather used to call the gangsters the lazzarone, the bums. They just lived off of taking from other people. And so when I wrote this book, it came out right around the time when The Sopranos, I think it came out in 96, 97. The Sopranos came out in 1998. I was interviewed on CNN and different things about what does it mean, this gangster stuff? What is the meaning of it? And so whenever there was a documentary film, like there was one on John Gotti called Godfather and Son, the Gotti story or something like that. And they came to me and they said, well, we want to understand how John Gotti got his son to be a gangster. And I said, it wasn't John Gotti who John Gotti, first of all, was kind of an anomaly because most gangsters don't want their children involved. They're not like Don Corleone. I mean, that's all fiction. Most of them don't want their children involved. In fact, the gangsters' kids that I grew up with all became doctors, lawyers, dentists, musicians, artists, whatever. They had nothing to do with their father or grandfather's business. That was a transition period that they had gone through. So I get asked a lot, especially now as I'm getting older, to talk about what it is in Italian culture that kind of facilitates behavior that is perceived. Like I kiss my buddies on both cheeks. Well, one time I did that. I was in Little Italy in Manhattan, and I heard a kid go by and say, "Mommy, is that guy a gangster?" And I just saw my friend from Italy, and I hadn't seen him in a while, and I kissed his cheeks. And so he had interpreted men kissing each other's cheeks as a sign from as a gangster, when really that's just a sign of male intimacy, friendship, not even deep intimacy, just friendship in Italian culture. So I realized that there's really a strong need for people who are able to take what stereotypes have created and debunk the myth of what creates Italian culture. It needs to be debunked, otherwise it will continue to exist.
Fred, as an Italian American, I relate to 99% of what you've just been talking about. And it's so refreshing to hear it, and you speak it so just from your heart, from truth, from experience. When we were on the phone, we talked for over an hour, and I could have talked to you for another 10 hours. You were so fascinating. You talked about your grandfather, you talked about your childhood, and you talked about the untimely deaths of your father and grandfather. Would you share that with us today?
Sure. It took a while before I could talk about any of this. And by a while, I mean my godfather was killed when I was 7. My father was killed when I was 10, and my grandfather when I was 14. And it wasn't really until I was 50 years old and going through a divorce and going through therapy that I began to articulate it to other people. I had been writing about it. I had not really released anything about it. Once in a while, with close friends, it would come up. But even with my ex-wife, I didn't say much about it at all until I went through the trauma of the breakup of our relationship. But to me, in retrospect, I can't believe I survived that era, and not just me, my brothers and sister. I had one sister and 2 other brothers. That we all became pretty solid people in spite of that
Hmm.
the violence that we had experienced and witnessed as kind of certainly every few years occurrence. It was there was a while in my life where I just kept waiting for the next person to
Hmm.
get to die, because it was so normal in our environment. My godfather was he died when he was 25 years old. He was holding up a golf course called Indian Boundary at the time. He was part of a group that was trying to rob it, and he got shot, and they dumped him outside of a hospital, and he ended up dying. And 3 years later, my father and my grandfather had a pawn shop business. And my father was murdered, and the police said it must have been a drifter, a stranger coming by, because the pawn shop was located right next to the railroad tracks. They said maybe somebody got off the train, killed them, and went back on the train.
Hmm.
They knew
Uh,
they knew who had killed my father. It was a guy who had been working as a hitman for organized crime. He wasn't sanctioned to kill my father. He wasn't ordered to kill my father. He took it upon himself to kill my father because he owed my father money, and my father refused to take the stuff that he had stolen as payment for what he owed, and he owed him money. My father was a very good golfer, and the guy owed him money because he lost thousands of dollars playing golf with my father. And he just took it upon himself to confront my father, and when my father didn't give in, he killed him.
hmm.
Years later, after my father was killed, my grandfather took me into the business. I was 10, going on 11 years old. And from 11 to 14, he trained me to take over the pawn shop. And then he was killed in a robbery in 1966. I was 14. And after that, I had to take over the family business during off school hours. I went to school, and then after school I would come and because by law you had to keep the pawn shop open for a year or 6 months so people could redeem their merchandise. And
Wow.
since I knew the business, they had a policeman there, and uh, he stood there while I wasn't allowed to do any of the other selling or anything, just redeeming merchandise. So I did it after school from like 3:30 until 6:30 every night, and then from 9 to 4 on the weekends, on Saturdays, until we fulfilled the law, and my grandmother sold the contents of the business, and that was the end of that.
You became a man overnight. And it wasn't just the loss of your godfather, your father, it was three, it was your grandpa too. And then on top of suffering the losses, you had to work, you had to take over the business. And
Well, when I remember the day that my father was killed, my grandfather had been out of town. He came back into town, and I was in the basement with the men. All the women were upstairs keening. They were
yeah,
incredible crying.
yeah.
People were walking in and out of the house with food for people. I
Mhm,
mean, it's like this automatic thing took over,
mhm,
where the whole neighborhood started taking care of everybody, you know. And
mhm,
my grandfather bursts in and he's looking for me and he sees me and I'm about to start crying because I still wasn't sure what was going on.
mhm.
Um, and he says, he said, so he saw me starting to cry and he picked me up and he shook me so hard my glasses flew off my face. And he says, "You are the man in the house. Men don't cry.
Mhm.
Uh, and you have to take care of your mother now. You have to take care of your brothers and sisters." And what happened was not only did I, do that, but I didn't cry until my wife left me 40 something years later. I didn't cry at all my whole life. There was nothing that happened in life that could make me cry. Um, and I thought I was a feeling sensitive person, you know.
Mm.
But,
Um, After the year was up and your grandmother sold the business, how did you guys survive? Did your mom go back to work? Did you continue working?
um, my mother did not go back to work. We survived because my grandmother's largesse. My grandmother took care of us for the most part. But all the kids, I thought I was free. That I was, going on 15. I thought, well, I'm free of this pawn shop now. I'm free of this. And my grandmother said, no, you're working for me now. You're going to, take care of the building and all that. And I said, all right, I'll do that because I had done that anyway with my grandfather. Um, but then my mother came up to me and she says, now you're going to work for this guy. And
Oh,
this guy
wow.
was our neighbor who had uh, a restaurant supply business, whose brother was deeply involved in organized crime. And it was the way that I began to learn about organized crime um, outside of books. In other words, I began to
Mhm,
really get involved because most of the clients that we had in the restaurant supply business were bars and nightclubs, restaurants owned by guys who were associated with organized crime. And I began to see it in a way that I had only kind of vaguely understood before, but I began to know it on a very intimate basis. Um, and my paychecks went to my mother. Um, and when I needed money, I would have to ask her to give me the money. But then I found ways of making money, getting cash by doing things for the brother of one of the owners who was deeply involved in organized crime. And I did that until their father, who was the head of the Genovese family in New York, um, when he was killed, um, I went off to the University of Wisconsin and I didn't turn my head back around until I started writing the book about wise guys to wise men. So
So you could have very easily gone down a different path than the one you chose.
sure, I
And
mean, yeah, but you have to see. But this is what people don't realize. People don't realize that, you know, we call it organized crime, but it's really organized business. And some of
yes,
the business is
that's right.
legal, and some of the business is illegal. Uh,
Right.
I was working for the legal business that
Mhm,
supported some of the illegal stuff, but it was
mhm,
totally legal. The brother I worked for I don't think he ever was a suspect in any kind of nefarious thing, but his brother was.
Hmm.
And so I got to learn about this world of, that at the time, you're beginning to see, this is the 1960s. So 69, The Godfather comes out.
Yeah.
1972, the movie comes out. And so I'm beginning to see this world in the movies, and I'm thinking, this ain't nothing like what I'm seeing and what I'm going through, and to the point that by the time I was writing From Wise Guys to Wise Men, my mother went to the same beautician as one of the head of organized crime in Chicago, his wife, and she was probably bragging about me writing this book. And I get a call saying, the old man wants to have lunch with you.
Oh boy.
And so next time you're in town, and so I asked, what was it about? And they said, he just wants to talk to you. So we go and we have lunch. I come in and we have lunch. I'm not quite sure this guy is capable of hugging me and he's capable of strangling me. I was pretty sure he was going to hug me, but you can't be 100% sure. And so he turns to me after we're talking and he says, so what's this? I hear you're writing a book about us. And I said, I'm not writing about you. I'm writing about the representation of Italians as gangsters in movies. He goes, I just want to know one thing. Am I in your book? I said, no. He said, why not? Because you know this culture better than anybody else. You're not going to write it the way those stupid Hollywood people write stupid things. I got into this business because my father was incapable of making a better life, even though he came here to do that. I made sure that we would have that better life. And you don't see my kids involved in this. My kids are this and my kids are that. He goes, somebody's got to write about this stuff. And so then I went to him and I said, look, I have a question for you. After we had this conversation, I said, I have a question for you. I said, I think I know who killed my father. He goes, well, why are you going to go back? And, your father was 30 years ago. You're going to get your hands all dirty. Leave it. And so when I told him who I thought it was, he goes, look, I'm going to tell you this once and I'm never going to talk to you about it again. I'm not going to tell you he did it, but I'm not going to tell you he didn't do it. So that was typically the way those guys talked. So to me, it meant he did it. And that was his way of saying it without saying. And so, that was pretty much the end of it in terms of the encounters I had. I still to this day run into guys I grew up with who are peripherally or somewhat intimately involved with this world. But, I'm for a while, they called me the Mario Puzo of Melrose Park because I was writing about this stuff. The way Mario Puzo. But Mario Puzo also, he wasn't familiar with organized crime in the way that I was. He didn't grow up in it. He grew up around it. Most of the work that he did for The Godfather was based on research he did. It wasn't based on life experiences.
Today,
so
in your teachings, whether it's about the Italian diaspora or Italian American studies, who goes to your classes? Are they mostly Italian American kids or are they mostly everything else?
It's well, the one thing was, and I learned how to manipulate the academic requirement system. And so I always created courses that you could get required credit for.
Mm-hmm.
So it's everybody. In fact, I get students from all different cultures.
Mm-hmm.
In my Italian American Studies courses. And what kills me is when I get students who are not Italian American who do much better than the Italian American kids. But it's not a course that Italian Americans flock to. Although once they find out what the course is about, they come into it, but they're hesitant. Italian Americans are hesitant to identify educationally or professionally as Italian Americans. They're not quite sure what that's going to bring them, or if that's going to take them down a different road, a tougher road. They're not quite sure because it's not something that they've experienced in educational institutions. And when did you learn about being Italian American in your education? You know, I mean, you may have learned about Columbus, you may have learned about Capone, but you know, did they ever tell you anything about the Bella Figura, or you know what the traditional meaning of what it is to be a godfather or a godmother? You know, you don't learn that in schools.
No.
You don't learn Italian American culture the way you might learn African American culture, Jewish American culture,
That's for sure.
Irish American culture in schools. And so I get students from all over, and it's great. It's fun. Whenever I get the occasional Italian American student, I'll pronounce their name correctly. And sometimes they're so used to pronouncing their name incorrectly, they try to correct me.
Mm-hmm.
And they get intimidated by the fact that they don't speak Italian.
Yeah.
And they
It's
say,
happened to me where I pronounced their Italian name correctly and they reprimanded me and said, "That's not my name." And I said, "You got it." Whatever way you want to pronounce it is good.
you know, like a guy by the name of Basile goes by Basil.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an
Uh,
Americanization, really.
yeah, and I had a friend whose son came to one of my classes once, and I always knew this guy by his street name, but I never knew how to spell his last name. And and you know, and I never had occasion to see his name in print, but they called him Bobby Chirito.
Mm-hmm.
So I get this list of students in my class, and I'm reading the names out loud, and I'm reading Robert Chiarito, and he kind of says, "Well, Professor, my family pronounces it differently." He says, he said, "I think you grew up with my father." I go, "Your father?" He goes, "Well, we pronounce it Chirito." I said, "You're Bobby Chirito's kid?" I can't believe it. It was the first time I ever had a kid of a friend of mine in one of my classes. It was just like,
Wow.
but the idea of pronouncing the name differently, you know, and to me that goes back to Dr. Toni's question of the how the identity changes. You know,
Mm-hmm.
when the name changes,
Right.
and you don't, because Chiarito means very clear. That's the word. It's clear. Chiaro is clear.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the identity is cloudy. So
Yeah.
I think it's
Fred,
very
how many books have you written and where can we buy them?
well. You can Google my name. I'm all over Amazon. I think I have about 7 or 8 books that I've written and about 5 or 6 books that I've edited, with some of my writing inside the books. I'm in the process now of working, putting the finishing touches on a 20, almost about a 17-year project on Italian American humor and irony. Very few people have talked about, let alone written about, the role that humor plays in Italian American culture. And so that was I write books when I can't find what I'm looking for through my research. If I can't find it, then I start saying, why can't I find it? What's going on?
Mm.
And this particular project came to me as I was going through my divorce, and I was in, I guess I could call it depression now. I was in a depression, and I thought that the way of getting out of the depression was to laugh. I had to find a reason to laugh. So I started watching the Comedy Channel as the default channel in my television at home. And I looked, and there were very few Italian American comedians. I started to really watch, and I wondered why. And then when I did get to an Italian American comedian, they had a tendency to make fun of their family, make fun of some of the stereotypes that other people have helped to foster, and that was it. There was no sense of kind of a radical understanding of their own culture,
Mm.
the way that you get with Jews or
Yeah.
blacks or even Asians or East Asians. You know, it's one thing to make fun of your culture, but it's another thing to support your culture by use through humor.
Yeah.
And we don't get a lot of support for our culture. We get a lot of comedians who help us to laugh at our culture, but not to like turn our culture into something dynamic that we would want to continue to relate to.
Mhm. I
So that
see.
was the basis for the last book I'm working on now, which is going to be my last book, my last academic book. It's just getting to be, you know, I've got other stories that I want to tell, personal stories, and like, you know, what we just talked
Mm.
about, for example, I've been writing that for years, and when I went to a funeral once, one of the women of the men I used to work for turned to me and she said, "When are you going to write that book?" I said, "Oh, I don't know." She goes, "Well, they're all dead now. Nobody's can bother." And I said, "Well, they might be dead, but their kids and their grandkids are alive." And, you know, I mean, you know, so I suffered too much from being an Italian American in a very traditional sense of not talking
Mm.
about this stuff. You know, I had a Jewish friend tell me, "Well, if you were Jewish, you'd have been famous by now because you would have written all that stuff because we don't care what people think." I said, "Well, that's
Right. And that's the difference. As an Italian American, I really appreciate you and the work that you do and have done. Um, and it's just an honor to have you on our podcast. Thank you so much. And everyone out there, go out and buy Fred's books. They're as amazing as he is.
oh, thank you very much."